Winter of 1952. Dawn barely manages to break the darkness over the frozen port of Severodvinsk on the White Sea. The cranes remain motionless, sheathed in a crust of ice that glints under the pale northern light. On the pier, a group of engineers and officers of the Soviet Navy stand in silence, staring at the skeleton of a decommissioned diesel submarine. The metal is rusted, fissured by salt and years. The wind blows hard, carrying the smell of fuel and snow. Among them is Anatoly Alexandrov, captain second rank, in a long coat and naval cap. His face, toughened by the cold, holds a trace of impatience and doubt. He studies the hull of the old boat intently, not like a sailor sizing up a vessel, but like a scientist looking at a prototype that has failed. Around him, the men talk of repairs, of new diesel units, of impossible budgets. No one seems to look beyond the ice at their feet. Alexandrov breaks the silence with a phrase the wind nearly steals away. What if the boat never needed to come to the surface? Heads turn. One of the engineers, an older man with a cocked cap, smiles with irony. "What are you saying, comrade captain? Even fish have to come out of the water sometime." Another, younger, laughs, his teeth blue with cold. "An eternal boat? That doesn't exist." But Alexandrov doesn't laugh. His gaze stays fixed on the frozen sea, as if he sees something the others can't imagine. "Perhaps it doesn't exist yet," he replies. For a few seconds, no one speaks. Only the creak of ice against the pier breaks the silence. The men return to their tasks, closing the conversation in their minds. To them, it was an offhand remark, one of those odd ideas people utter on days that are too long and too cold. But Alexandrov does not forget it. That night, back in his lodgings, he writes a single line in a black-covered notebook. "Submarine with atomic power. Unlimited submersion." Then he closes the notebook and turns out the lamp. Years later, he would recall that moment as the instant he understood that the ocean was the one place where humanity had not yet carried the power of the atom. His question, hurled into the frozen air of Severodvinsk, was met with laughter, but within it hid the seed of a silent revolution. An idea so simple it sounded like madness, a submarine that never had to breathe, and with it began a secret race that would forever change the war beneath the sea. In the early years of the 1950s, the Cold War ceased to be a race for territory and became a competition at the limits of knowledge. The Earth's surface was already divided, the sky watched, and space scarcely a dream. Only one domain remained unexplored, vast and silent, the bottom of the sea. There, beneath the icy currents of the Atlantic and the Arctic, the two superpowers began a new form of confrontation. The ocean became the perfect place to hide the unthinkable. In 1952, while Alexandrov kept jotting ideas in his notebook, on the other side of the world, the United States Navy approved a project that would change naval warfare forever. The USS Nautilus, the first submarine powered by nuclear energy. It was the result of the vision of Admiral Hyman Rickover, an engineer as stubborn as Alexandrov, who had convinced Congress that atomic propulsion was not only possible, but inevitable. In less than 2 years, the Nautilus went from blueprints to reality. Its reactor was compact, safe, and capable of powering the submarine for months without the need to surface. In January of 1955, when it sent its first message to the world, "Underway on nuclear power," the phrase rang out like a warning. In Moscow, the news landed as a humiliation. Stalin had died in 1953, and the Soviet Union was passing through an uncertain transitional period. Power was split among Lavrenti Beria, Malenkov, and a promising first secretary named Nikita Khrushchev. Each sought to prove that Soviet socialism could not only match the West, but surpass it. Nuclear energy had been, until then, a symbol of national pride. The Soviets had detonated their first atomic bomb in 1949, just 4 years after the United States. But the sea was another story. There, the Soviet fleet remained anchored in the technology of the past, diesel engines, limited range, and an absolute dependence on air to breathe. When the Kremlin received the report on the Nautilus, the words were dry, but the meaning devastating. The United States now possesses a submarine with global range, unlimited operational capability, nuclear propulsion confirmed. For Soviet strategists, this was more than a military threat. It was a wound to pride. It meant the enemy could cross the Arctic, encircle Europe, and watch Soviet ports undetected. It meant that the ocean, for centuries, a natural shield, had become an enemy corridor. In a closed-door meeting, a general staff officer put it without metaphor. The sea is no longer our wall. It is their door. Beria, ever pragmatic, demanded an immediate response. "I want a boat that doesn't need oxygen," he said, "and I want it before the Nautilus reaches the North Pole." The words were entered into the minutes of the Council of Ministers, marking the start of a secret race to regain lost technological parity. Meanwhile, Alexandrov continued gathering his small cadre of physicists and technicians. In the workshops of Obninsk and Leningrad, they debated the possibility of miniaturizing a reactor. The problem was enormous, the risk incalculable, but the context made it inevitable. The sea had become a new battlefield, invisible, silent, endless. A war with no fronts and no flags, where the enemy might be kilometers beneath the ice. And in that silence, an idea born amid laughter began to take shape. Anatoly Petrovich Alexandrov was not a man of the sea. He was a physicist, engineer whose eyes fixed on calculations, not on the horizon. Born in 1903, he had spent his youth among laboratories and industrial shops, fascinated by the notion of domesticating the energy that makes the sun shine. When the Second World War ended, he was recruited by the Institute of Atomic Energy, where he worked under the charismatic Igor Kurchatov, father of the Soviet nuclear program. Together, they developed the country's first fission reactor in Obninsk, inaugurated in 1954. Alexandrov was neither diplomatic, nor obedient, nor patient. His mind ran faster than committees. In a world ruled by hierarchy and obedience, he preferred logic and persistence. Many considered him brilliant, others insufferable. At meetings of the Kurchatov Institute, he interrupted colleagues, corrected formulas for generals, and demanded resources the state could barely offer. But behind his abrasive character lay an obsession to take nuclear energy beyond power plants, beyond laboratories, to the world's limits. When he heard the news of the USS Nautilus, his reaction was neither surprise nor admiration. It was irritation. To him, it meant the Americans had done what the Soviets had deemed theoretically impossible. That gap haunted him. "If they did it," he wrote in an internal memo, "we must do it better." In 1952, he began meeting with officers of the Soviet Navy. Most listened out of courtesy. The admirals were men formed in the tradition of steel, gas oil, the thrum of diesel engines, and the smell of grease. The word reactor sounded to them like science fiction, not military strategy. In one early meeting in Leningrad, a veteran vice admiral, medals clinking on his uniform, cut him off with a tired smile. "Ships sail, they don't boil water," he said. Alexandrov looked up without smiling. "Without steam, comrade, no ship moves." An awkward silence followed. Then the vice admiral changed the subject. That exchange would be repeated many times. Alexandrov faced a wall of skepticism and fear. Naval engineers distrusted the atom. The military distrusted engineers. But gradually, his arguments gained ground. In a Soviet Union obsessed with matching Western advances, any idea promising technological superiority earned attention, however outlandish it seemed. By the end of 1953, Alexandrov and a group of scientists, among them Vladimir Peregudov and Nikolai Dolezhal, experts in metallurgy and naval design, produced a document that circulated discreetly among the ministries of industry and defense. The text proposed creating a nuclear-powered submarine able to remain submerged for 90 days and operate at any depth. Its name was provisional, Project 627. At first, the document was met with laughter. Some called it the atomic delusion, others a laboratory fantasy. But the laughter began to fade when the American Nautilus was launched in 1954. Then madness turned into urgency. In 1955, Alexandrov was summoned to Moscow. The new Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, needed symbols of progress, and the idea of an atomic submarine was perfect. During a session of the Politburo, Alexandrov presented his plan with an engineer's precision and a believer's passion. He spoke of unlimited endurance, of speed under the ice, of energy independence. When he finished, the hall fell silent. Khrushchev broke that silence with a clipped phrase. "Do it, Comrade Alexandrov, but do it before they cross the pole." With those words, the impossible became an order. Between 1952 and 1955, the idea born in laughter on an icy pier moved from ridicule to the halls of power. Alexandrov, the physicist with neither rank nor naval tradition, became the architect of a dream, the boat that would never need to surface. The project had been approved, but the real challenge was only beginning. In the laboratories of the Kurchatov Institute in Moscow, the physicists faced an apparently insoluble dilemma: to build a nuclear reactor so small and so stable that it could fit inside a submarine's steel hull. Nothing like it had ever been attempted. On land, stationary reactors worked in ideal conditions, enormous, heavy, surrounded by concrete shields and kilometers of piping. But under the sea, there would be no space, no margin for error. The new boat's heart had to be compact, silent, and absolutely reliable. A failure would not mean a breakdown. It would mean a radiological catastrophe hundreds of meters deep. During the first months of 1954, Alexandrov's engineers designed dozens of configurations. Some proposed graphite reactors, others heavy water. None offered the necessary balance of power and safety. The fuel had to be highly enriched uranium, capable of sustaining the reaction for months without refueling, and the cooling system had to function even under the harshest conditions. Any air bubble, any minuscule leak could trigger an explosion. In the experimental shops of Obninsk, where early tests took place, results were disheartening. In February, a faulty valve allowed part of the radioactive steam to escape into the environment. Technicians managed to halt the process, but one of them, a young engineer barely 27, inhaled the toxic cloud. He died a few days later. The internal report described the accident with bureaucratic coldness: excess exposure to ionizing radiation during maintenance operation. When news reached the committee, several ministers demanded the project's suspension. Too dangerous, they said. Unnecessary. Alexandrov refused. He summoned his colleagues in the Institute's meeting room. There was silence. The walls smelled of scorched metal and fear. "Comrades," he said tensely, "if we don't take risks, we will go on breathing diesel smoke." Some looked at him, in confusion, others with admiration. No one answered. He continued, "The enemy is already under the ice. If we fail, it won't be science that is lost, but history." His words ended the discussion. The tests continued. Over the following months, the team perfected a pressurized water reactor model, more compact than any previous design. It used light water as both moderator and coolant, contained in a closed circuit able to endure extreme pressures. The pumps were small, but surgically precise. Each valve was assembled by hand. The biological shield was designed with alternating layers of lead and steel, thick enough to contain radiation, but not so heavy as to sink the boat. On the longest nights, Alexandrov stayed in the lab, running the numbers again and again. He didn't trust reports, he trusted numbers. Colleagues would find him at dawn with the same phrase on his lips: "The energy is there. We only have to teach it obedience." By the end of 1954, the prototype reactor managed to sustain a stable reaction for more than 100 hours. The team celebrated in silence. No one told the press, no one briefed the general staff. Only those present knew what they had achieved. They had lit a miniature sun. The technical dilemma was not fully resolved, but the principle was proven. The uranium could be controlled, the water confined, the heat tamed, and with that, Alexandrov's dream, a submarine that would never need to breathe, ceased to be a fantasy. It had become a project. In the summer of 1953, the Council of Ministers of the Soviet Union officially approved the development of a nuclear-powered submarine. The document, classified Special Secret, bore a simple code name, Project 627. In the margins, a single handwritten word summed up its ambition, Kit, which in Russian means whale. Command of the project fell to two men of opposite temperaments. Vladimir Peregudov, a methodical, quiet, rigorous naval designer, was responsible for the ship's structure. Beside him, Anatoly Alexandrov, brilliant and temperamental, took charge of the atomic heart, the reactor. One calculated the shape of the steel, the other of the fire. Tension between them was constant, but the common goal held them together. The objective was as clear as it was inhuman: to build a submarine capable of remaining 90 days beneath the sea without surfacing, traveling intercontinental distances, and carrying torpedoes fitted with nuclear warheads. It would be not just a war machine, but a symbol, a message to Washington. The ocean could belong to Moscow too. The clock was already running. On the other side of the planet, the USS Nautilus was preparing for its first voyage to the North Pole. The Soviets had to catch up before that feat became an absolute triumph of the Western world. Each day lost, wrote Alexandrov in his diary, is one more mile under the ice for them. The Kit's design broke with everything Soviet naval engineering knew. It had a double-hulled steel body to withstand water pressure and protect the reactor from external impacts. Its propulsion system consisted of two pressurized water reactors connected to a single central propeller. On the plans, the boat measured 110 meters in length, with room for 104 crewmen and an oxygen reserve, able to sustain them for 3 months. The project proceeded under obsessive security. The Severodvinsk shipyards were ringed with barbed wire and watchtowers. Workers didn't know what they were building. Each section of the hull was assembled in silence, without information about its purpose. Reports from the State Security Committee described the secrecy level as equivalent to the atomic bomb program. In Moscow's offices, the political leadership saw the project as an opportunity. Nikita Khrushchev, who had just consolidated his power, needed to show that the new Soviet era was bolder, more modern, more futuristic. A nuclear submarine was the perfect emblem. The Americans build skyscrapers, he said. We will build the ocean's foundations. Alexandrov worked without rest. He slept in his office, surrounded by blueprints and formulas. Technicians said he moved like a man chased by something invisible. Peregudov, more cautious, warned him constantly. A reactor is not a steam boiler. It doesn't forgive mistakes. But Alexandrov replied with a conviction bordering on faith. If the atom's energy destroyed a city, he said, it can also move a fleet. In 1955, the hull of the first Soviet nuclear submarine began to take shape. The steel plates were so thick they had to be heated before welding. Engineers calculated every centimeter to distribute the weight of the shielding and the reactor. No one knew whether the boat would float once assembled. Meanwhile, in Washington, the Nautilus was already sailing. The world watched in awe as the American submarine made the first crossing under the polar ice. In Moscow, the news was received with a cold silence. Alexandrov said only one sentence, noted by a colleague in his lab notebook. They were first, but we will not fail. Project 627 was no longer a dream or a gamble. It was a race, and each weld, each calculation, and each night shift in the yard was another battle in the war that could not be seen from the surface. The northern winter does not forgive. In Severodvinsk, the air freezes before it reaches the ground, and the White Sea seems a motionless slab of ice. On the snow-covered docks, shipyard number 402 works day and night, lit by yellowish floodlights that reflect on the frost. There, in secret, Hull 501 rises, the first Soviet nuclear submarine. Thousands of workers labor under a regime of absolute silence. None knows the real purpose of what they are building. Orders arrive in sealed envelopes. Plans are fragmented so no one sees the complete design. Supervisors speak little. Conversations stop when state security officers approach. For most men, Hull 501 is just another military project. But those closest to the assembly line know it isn't. The metal they raise is different, heavier, denser. The parts they carry are marked with unknown codes. The construction chief, Captain First Rank Frolov, is a hard-jawed man with a hoarse voice, a veteran of the Baltic shipyards. Each morning he strides along the pier, checking cranes, welders, and the steel plates that are forming the submarine's body. His presence commands respect. One night, inspecting the main shop, he stops beside a group of exhausted engineers and says quietly, "We're not building a boat, we're building credibility." No one answers, but all understand. That phrase sums up the project's weight. If the kit failed, not only would a submarine sink, the reputation of all Soviet science would sink with it. Working conditions border on inhuman. Temperatures drop below 30 degrees below zero. Hands crack and bleed inside gloves. Welds must be done under heated tents because steel fractures in the cold. Each shift consumes tons of electrodes and meters upon meters of electric cabling. Workers toil in 12-hour rotations, unaware that every rivet, every joint is meant to withstand not just the sea's pressure, but the weight of nuclear fire. Engineers face unprecedented challenges. The biological shielding around the reactor must protect the crew from radiation without compromising buoyancy. Alexandrov and Peregudov choose a bold solution, combine lead and water in internal chambers, serving both as thermal insulation and counterweight. The design is elegant but dangerous. If a valve breaks, radioactive water could flood compartments. Each decision becomes a wager between efficiency and survival. Workers don't know those calculations. They only know the material is different, heavier, denser. The engineers call it reactor steel. It's a special low-carbon alloy with high heat resistance. When welding sparks fall on the frozen floor, they look like tiny comets dying in the dark. Sometimes the men joke to break the tension. "What do you think this monster will be?" a welder asks. "A boat to go to hell," another replies, not looking up. Meanwhile, in Moscow, weekly reports reach Khrushchev's desk couched in careful language. Hull assembly progressing as planned, containment system tested, deadlines unchanged. But between the lines hides the truth. The project is consuming resources, lives, and hours no one can replace. In one shop, a crane collapses while moving a hull section. 2 workers die, crushed. The official report limits itself to one phrase: work accident during routine operation. Their families are never told the real purpose of the job they died for. At nightfall, Frolov paces the yard shrouded in steam. At his side, Alexandrov watches the progress of Hull 501, a mass of steel rising from the snow, motionless, silent, as if waiting for a soul. "It looks like a sleeping whale," the engineer says. "Let's hope it wakes," Frolov replies. Both know half the work remains. The boat's heart, the reactor, has yet to be installed, but the body already exists. Alexandrov's dream now has shape, weight, and a name. Under the northern lights, the metal gleams as if it were breathing. The men of steel regard it with respect, not fully realizing that in that moment they are shaping the most powerful and silent weapon humanity has ever built. December of 1957. Winter covers Severodvinsk with a meter-thick layer of ice. Inside the shipyard, the air is dense, heavy with the smell of oil and hot metal. In an underground room, shielded by walls of steel and lead, a small group of engineers watch a console filled with needles, valves, and gauges. It is the first Soviet nuclear reactor designed for a submarine, and that morning, after 5 years of work, it is about to awaken. The silence is absolute. In a corner, Alexandrov reviews the parameters one last time. Coolant flow, primary circuit pressure, outlet temperature. Everything seems correct. No one speaks. The men know that even the smallest mistake could blow the entire chamber. In the official record, that moment will be described with cold technical language. Controlled startup test of reactor OK-150, model for submarine project 627. But those who were there would remember something else, the feeling of standing before a heart about to beat for the first time. The shift chief, a young engineer named Sokolov, looks at the clock. 0 hour, comrades, he says, his voice trembling. He turns the main lever. The control rod lifts slowly. A deep hum fills the room. Water begins to move within the closed circuit, vibrating with a new force. Instruments respond. Pressure rises, temperature too. and suddenly a needle jumps off scale. The cooling system shows an unexpected drop in flow. A faulty valve reduces the water entering the core. In seconds, the heat spikes. If it continues, the reaction will run away. Sokolov turns to Alexandrov, pale. Unstable pressure. Reactor overheating. For an instant, panic takes hold. Some step back. One reaches for the emergency shutdown. Alexandrov stops him with a terse gesture. "No, more flow," he orders without raising his voice. But the pressure? More flow now. Don't stop the heart just as it starts to beat. The technicians obey. They open the supplementary valves. Cold water enters the circuit. The hum becomes a roar. The needles quiver, then steady. Pressure falls. Temperature slowly descends. On the panel, the red line returns to its normal range. The danger has passed. For a long minute, no one moves. Then an engineer murmurs. Reactor, stable. Nominal power achieved. No one applauds. No one smiles. All know what has just happened. A contained spark, a battle won in silence. Alexandrov removes his glasses, wipes them on his sleeve, and examines the indicators with a calm that only now seems real. For the first time, a Soviet submarine reactor runs autonomously. The heat from its core keeps the closed steam circuit moving, driving the turbines. In the pipes, water boils without being lost, spinning in an endless cycle of energy. There is no smoke, no flame, no noise. Only the low murmur of something that seems alive. Hours later, at dusk, the engineers walk out to the pier. Snow crunches under their boots. On the horizon, the hull of submarine K3, still unnamed, rests in dry dock, motionless, waiting for its new heart to be installed. Alexandrov stops before it, hands in his coat pockets. "It has infinite energy," he says softly. Beside him, Frolov nods. "Let's hope it has patience too." The reactor had ignited more than turbines. It had ignited an era. From that day on, the sea ceased to be just water. It became an extension of the atom. April of 1958. After months of preparation, nuclear submarine K3, still without an official name, is ready for its first trial run. The Severodvinsk pier lies under a low, cold mist. The air smells of metal, salt, and anxiety. On the conning tower, a red flag without inscription flutters. Aboard, 104 men, mostly diesel sailors transferred from other units, eye the new electrical panels and pipes with curiosity. None has ever sailed with a reactor under his feet. Commander Leonid Osipenko, a methodical reserved officer, receives the order to begin the diving trials. His voice is steady, but his hands tremble slightly as he gives the signal. Prepare to dive. Reactor at initial power. The technicians in the nuclear compartment adjust the valves. The reactor's deep hum grows deeper, like a heart beginning to pound. The gauges settle. Pressure indicators glow green. The boat sinks slowly, leaving behind the gray surface of the White Sea. At 100 meters, the external lights go out. At 200, the world's sound disappears. At 300 meters, Osipenko lifts the intercom and speaks the words that will be entered in the official report. Depth 300 meters, reactor stable. Engineers exchange looks. In the control room, the air is dense and warm. No one speaks. The sea's silence fuses with the constant drone of the cooling pumps. K3 continues descending, testing its resistance, its balance, its soul. Over the next 72 hours, the submarine remains underwater, sailing without stopping, without surfacing even once. The reactor holds steady power. Oxygen consumption is controlled. The crew learns to live with the idea that the surface is no longer a necessity, but a choice. They sleep, work, and eat, surrounded by steel and silence. Outside, only liquid darkness. The first Soviet nuclear submarine has kept its promise: total autonomy. On the third day, Osipenko orders the ascent. The boat breaks the surface with a metallic groan. In the conning tower, the officers gather around a makeshift table. There is no champagne, no speeches, only a thermos of hot tea. They toast with aluminum cups. One smiles and says, "Now we sail with a sun inside." Alexandrov, who has kept silent the whole voyage, watches them from the hatch, his hands still stained with grease from the reactor compartment. His eyes are tired, but he shows no emotion. He sips tea, sets the cup down, and murmurs, "Now we can disappear from the map whenever we want." No one answers. The words are both a statement and a warning. For the first time in Soviet history, there exists a machine capable of diving for months, crossing oceans unseen, and striking from anywhere on the planet. The final test report bears a single line: nuclear propulsion confirmed, total thermal stability, autonomy, 72 hours. But what the document didn't say was what everyone felt. The sea no longer belonged to nature. It now belonged to the atom. Word of K3's success soon reached the other side of the ocean. By late 1958, American listening stations in the North Atlantic detected an unusual phenomenon: an unknown underwater thermal signature, too steady, too powerful to be a diesel engine. U.S. Navy analysts understood at once what it meant. Moscow had done it. The balance of maritime power had just shifted. The Pentagon moved quickly. The Polaris and Skipjack programs, until then experimental projects, received unlimited funding. In a matter of months, development accelerated on the first submarine-launched ballistic missiles and a new generation of nuclear-powered vessels. For the first time since the end of the Second World War, the United States had lost technological initiative, and it did not intend to tolerate it. In Moscow, the reaction was triumphant. Nikita Khrushchev appeared before the press surrounded by red flags and decorated officers. With his characteristic tone, half taunt, half challenge, he declared to the cameras, "The Americans laugh at our boots, but now they will have to laugh underwater. It is the revenge of Soviet ingenuity." The announcement became an instant propaganda success. Newspapers published illustrations of submarines crossing the Arctic, able to launch nuclear torpedoes from anywhere on the planet. The Soviet Union presented itself as a power that could strike from the sea's silence. To the world, K3 was a technological marvel. To those who worked on it, it was a dangerous, fragile machine. Beneath the sheen of propaganda, reality was darker. K3's reactor worked, yes, but its auxiliary systems were unstable. Radioactive leaks were frequent, seals warped under pressure. The biological shield bled heat into crew compartments. Men lived in constant heat, breathing air saturated with humidity and metallic dust. During a patrol in the Norwegian Sea, a short circuit sparked a small fire in the electrical compartment. Sailors put it out in minutes, but radiation rose sharply in the aft reactor sector. No one reported the incident to Central Command. The official log read simply, "Thermal anomaly corrected." Alexandrov and Peregudov knew that every hour of reactor operation was both a victory and a warning. The atom had been domesticated, but not tamed. The containment system ran at the limit, and any mistake could turn the boat into a radioactive tomb. Even so, the Kremlin's orders were clear: longer patrols, deeper dives, more demonstrations. At a technical meeting, Peregudov dared to protest. "Comrade Alexandrov, if we keep demanding more from the reactor than it can give, one day it will shut down without warning." Alexandrov didn't look up from the plans. "Then we'll build another," he said, "but let it not shut down while they're watching." Such was the price of perfection, living on the edge of failure, sustaining the myth with every kilowatt. K3's achievements were presented to the world as definitive proof of Soviet ingenuity. But on the Severodvinsk docks, technicians knew another truth. The reactors were new, yes, but unpredictable. Leaks were sealed with metal tape, valves were replaced in secret, reports were polished before reaching Moscow. The boat of the future existed, but every meter of its steel hit a crack. Beneath the propaganda's shine, the nation's most advanced machine was propped on fear, sacrifice, and silence. Perfection had a price, and it had already begun to collect. Barents Sea, March of 1961. K3 Leninsky Komsomol, now officially named and the pride of the Soviet fleet, is on a routine patrol beneath the polar ice. In the control room, the heat is stifling. The walls sweat moisture, and men work with uniforms glued to their skin. The reactor is run continuously for more than a month. The indicators read within normal ranges, but the nuclear compartment engineers notice something troubling. The coolant flow seems to fluctuate. Chief Technician Vasilyev checks the pressurized water valves. There's a sudden pressure drop in the secondary line, a minimal variation, barely perceptible. But in a reactor, a minimal variation can herald disaster. Vasilyev informs the watch officer. He answers with a blunt order: increase water flow, maintain power. For a few minutes, everything seems to stabilize. Then, the radiation counter begins to show anomalous values. In the control chamber, men feel a faint dizziness, a ringing in their ears. The dosimeter needle climbs slowly, almost elegantly, as if reluctant to alarm. But it climbs. Vasilyev grasps what is happening. A leak in the primary cooling circuit. Radioactive water is seeping into the auxiliary system. In minutes, the radiation level increases tenfold. Shut. Down the reactor, one officer shouts. Protocol requires waiting for the commander's authorization, but there is no time. Vasilyev runs to the control levers and begins inserting the graphite rods by hand. The heat hits him like a wall. His gloves melt on his hands. Another technician helps, covering his face with a soaked towel. Together, they halt the reaction. When the core shuts down, silence returns to the boat. But the price is high. The two men do not see the end of the watch. One dies that very night, the other the next day, in a military hospital. The rest of the crew survives, but the radiation doses will mark them for life. Commander Osipenko drafts a laconic report: incident in cooling system. Reactor shut down manually. Minimal human losses. Reactor stable. In Moscow, the document is reviewed, rewritten, and stamped with a single phrase: minor incident. No media outlet publishes it. No commission investigates. The boat is repaired in silence and returns to service within weeks. The bodies of the two technicians are buried in an anonymous cemetery near Murmansk. There is no ceremony, no flag, no address. Only a brief note in their files: died in the line of duty. When K3 returns to port, Alexandrov is there. He meets it at the pier, in his black coat, his face hardened by the wind. He doesn't ask about the reactor or the reports. He simply walks to the hatch and looks at the salt-blackened hull. Beside him, a young engineer offers the accident's technical data. Alexandrov doesn't listen. He takes his notebook, writes a single sentence, and puts it away in silence. The atom does not forgive carelessness. That night, he remains in his office, reviewing the cooling system schematics, emergency protocols, shipyard letters. No one sees him weep, but witnesses recall that, for the first time, he seemed old. He knew science hadn't failed, men had, and he knew too that sooner or later it would happen again. K3 sailed again. The Soviet Union celebrated it as a symbol of power, but those who worked inside its hull knew the truth. Beneath the steel and the pride, danger was constant, invisible, inexhaustible. The atom granted infinite energy, but demanded absolute obedience. K3. Leninsky Komsomol was not just a boat, it was the start of an era. Its success marked the turning point in Soviet naval history. From its structure, its triumphs, and its errors, a new generation of atomic submarines would be born. The Hotel, Echo, and November classes, each more sophisticated, more silent, and more lethal than the last. In the early 1960s, the Arctic became the new stage of the Invisible War. Under the ice, the American Skipjack and George Washington submarines shared the same silence as their Soviet counterparts. The waters of the North Pole, once deemed inhospitable, became a highway of submerged steel. For the first time in history, both superpowers could destroy each other without ever leaving the sea. The USSR had achieved strategic parity with the US Navy. Kremlin officials could utter the word balance without irony. Soviet nuclear submarines patrolled the oceans for months, invisible to radar, able to surface beneath ice to launch long-range missiles. The country's defense doctrine changed forever. Meanwhile, Anatoly Alexandrov, the man who had imagined the impossible, was named director of the Kurchatov Institute. He became the most influential figure in the Soviet nuclear program, though he never sought the spotlight. At official ceremonies, he kept to the side, standing with his hands clasped behind his coat, listening to admirals who took credit for his idea. When journalists tried to interview him, he answered with brief, almost terse phrases. On one occasion, a young reporter asked what the secret of Soviet success over the Americans had been. Alexandrov looked at him a moment before replying, The Americans thought about speed. We thought about survival. That sentence defined an entire philosophy. For the United States, the goal was maximum power, maximum range, technical superiority. For Alexandrov, the goal was simpler and deeper, to build something that could resist, survive, endure. His obsession was never glory, but permanence. The concept of a submarine with infinite propulsion went from madness to strategic doctrine. On general staff maps, patrol zones expanded from the Barents Sea to the Pacific. The closed ocean became a territory of permanent war. Under the northern ice, dozens of Soviet submarines began to operate in rotating shifts. Each boat carried not only missiles, but also the promise of invisible deterrence. The enemy might attack, yes, but would never know from where the response would come. In Moscow, speeches celebrated progress, science, national pride. But among the engineers who had worked on Project 627, the tone was more sober. They knew the achievement had been built on sacrifices, errors, and silences. Alexandrov often recalled the names of technicians who had died in tests, the ones no one mentioned in parades. In a private meeting, he once said, "The heroes aren't those who sail in these boats, they're the ones who made them float." His crazy idea had become one of the pillars of Soviet strategy throughout the Cold War. From then on, the atom's power was no longer only a symbol of destruction, but an instrument of invisibility, a power hidden beneath the ice. The sea no longer belonged to men or to tides. It belonged to machines that didn't need to breathe. Decades later, K3 Leninsky Komsomol rests motionless at a northern pier, turned into a museum. It lies in Murmansk under a gray sky that seems never to change. Its metal is blackened by time, joints sealed with resin, the reactor silent forever. Inside, the air smells of old oil and the dust of history. Visitors walk in silence through its narrow passages, observing rusted consoles, tiny bunks, clocks stopped in another age. On the walls, plaques with engraved names, engineers, workers, captains. Not all faces are remembered, but each name stands for a fragment of the dream that carried the atom to the ocean floor. In one corner of the route, there is a black and white photograph. It occupies no more than a small frame, half hidden among plans and technical documents. It shows a man with a serene expression, steady gaze, dark coat, Anatoly Alexandrov. The caption reads simply, "Scientist, dreamer, father of the Soviet nuclear submarine." Guides scarcely mention him, some visitors pass by, but those who stop before his portrait notice something in his expression. Neither pride nor triumph, but the calm of one who knew his greatest victory was not visible from the surface. History called him stubborn, his colleagues reckless, his enemies eccentric. But his madness changed the war. From the day he imagined a boat that didn't need to breathe, the ocean ceased to be a natural refuge. It became the new battlefield where borders can't be seen and enemies do not meet. Beneath the world's dark waters, atomic power found its quietest form, the submarine that could wait for months before revealing its existence. K3 was the first, but many followed. Some sailed without incident, others never returned. Each, however, carried within a common heritage. Alexandrov's idea, his faith that science could defeat fear, his belief that the atom could serve not only to destroy, but to sustain. Today, the sea around Murmansk seems calm, but beneath its surface, the kit's descendants still move. Invisible machines crossing currents without a trace, reminders that humanity learned to hide its most terrible power under the water's stillness. The sea was never the same again, and under its waves humanity learned to hide the end of the world.